Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast that explores nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode 7, I'm going to take an in-depth look at the backyard birding studio, specifically how to create one and how to use the studio to produce great shots you will like and you'll be proud of. Wildlife photography is a very challenging genre, and because of that, I recommend starting right in your own backyard. And there's no better place to get used to the equipment you're using, to work with a subject that's relatively easy to work with, and it'll get you started on the right foot. If you go hog wild and you go out immediately and start shooting difficult shots in the wild, difficult exposures, so on and so forth, you're going to get frustrated relatively quickly. So definitely try this. This is the step one in really taking your wildlife photography to the next level. So I want to get right into this by describing what a backyard studio is and what it isn't. A backyard studio is not necessarily a complex studio like you would see when you're doing a commercial shoot or when you're doing any other kind of model shoots or anything like that. This is simply stated, it's a small area in your backyard where you can set up a few items to lure a bird in, photograph the bird. At the same time, you're helping the bird by feeding it. So it's kind of a win-win for both parties. So there are several levels of backyard studio. You can start out very simply, and you can take it way up to this complex monstrosity. And obviously I recommend starting simple. So level 1, the level 1 birding studio is kind of where I'm going to start here. And this is kind of a beginner's setup, and honestly a setup that I still use today, depending on what I'm trying to accomplish. So first, there's bird feeder setup. Now there's several bird feeders out there on the market. There's a platform type of bird feeder. There is a kind of your standard typical bird feeder with sides where you put the seat in the top, and there's perches on both sides. I'm okay with both of those options. Just bear in mind that if you're using a standard bird feeder, it has its own perches on it, and so birds are going to want to land on those perches rather than your perch. So that brings us to the next point, which is, I don't want to take photographs of a bird on a bird feeder, unless I'm going to do a shot for a magazine that sells bird feeders. I generally don't want to do that. I'm trying to show a bird in its natural habitat, not eating from a feeder. But again, that's perfectly acceptable if you're trying to show man interacting with nature. So don't discard that shot, or disregard that shot. Rather, I want to teach you kind of a more natural setup. So perch selection. You're going to have to select a perch that fits the bird species. So what do I mean by that? Well, you don't get a giant log and set it out by the bird feeder if you're photographing a finch, because a finch is a very small bird, and the log is so big in the frame that it makes the bird look funny because it mismatches the size. It's just very awkward looking. So you want to find a kind of a dainty perch for a dainty bird. So small branches, things along those lines are what you're looking for. Be careful about when you cut your perch, or when you find your perch on the ground or wherever you're going to find it. Be careful that you don't break off the perch in an unnatural way. So I do have a few shots of an unnatural looking perch that I'll post in the show notes. It's good for starting. It's fine for starting out, but if you want something that looks really natural, look for something on the ground that's fallen off the tree, or something that has moss on it or lichen. Something that has an interesting appeal, not just a dead snag, if you will. So you've selected your perch. Let's just say we're shooting photographs of a house finch. You selected your perch. It's a relatively small branch. How do I attach this perch? There's a couple ways you can do this. Some are destructive, and some are more permanent. Some are temporary. What I recommend doing is just keeping it simple initially. You can attach the perch to. You can get these little, I guess, poles, if you will, from Lowe's or Home Depot or somewhere like that, and you can actually nail your perch into the side of that, and then you can drive that pole into the ground right next to the bird feeder. Now, it has to actually be close to the bird feeder. It can't be 10 feet away or anything like that. It actually has to be adjacent to it, almost like the bird could just hop from the stick onto the feeder. That's the most basic setup, and that's the one I recommend you start with. Because what's going to happen is the birds are going to come down to the feeder. You might have 4 or 5 birds down there, and they're going to get kind of protective of the feeder. And so there's always going to be one bird that's waiting to get a spot in that feeder. And that's what that perch is for. And so that bird's going to come down, he's going to land right there, and you're going to get the shot. Okay, so that's the perch. What about the blind? So you can't just be standing out there 2 feet away and hope that the bird lands on the perch. Birds obviously are very skittish of people, although not as skittish as some animals are. The birds do get used to you to some degree, but I highly recommend using some kind of blind. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, blinds come in several types. You have, first of all, the easiest one, which is your car. You can roll the car into your yard next to your perch, and depending on your lens selection, that determines your distance from the perch, from lens to perch. So if I drive my car into my yard and I have a 300 millimeter lens and I'm shooting a house finch, I probably want to be within 6 feet of that perch, and so the car it's not really a good thing for that. If I were shooting with a longer lens, the car would be a better option. What I ask that people start out with, and what I recommend, is just going ahead and taking a window in your home. You take the window, preferably one that's facing east or west. Now, why do you do that? Because if you're facing east or west, that means that the sun is going to be at the right angle to illuminate the bird. If you're facing south, for example, you're going to have side lighting and sometimes backlighting, and that's not going to be the best kind of lighting for a simple setup. Okay, I'll talk more about lighting later. But for now, I recommend you start with a window in your home. You open the window, of course. Don't shoot through glass. It's terrible. You paid all that money for your lens, and then you shoot through glass and ruin the quality of your image. So that's how that works. Basically, in review, you set up the bird feeder, you find a perch, you attach the perch, and you shoot from a window in your home. Of course, I recommend using a tripod in this scenario, and the reason for that is oftentimes you're shooting early in the morning, and you don't have a strong light, and usually if you're shooting with consumer grade lenses, you're going to be at 5.6, and you're going to have a very low shutter speed. You're talking, even at ISO 400 early in the morning, you're probably talking a 60th of a second. So you got to get a tripod, and I don't even recommend shooting at a 60th of a second for birds. I would, especially small birds, I wouldn't shoot them any less than a 250th. That's just my personal opinion on that. Okay, so that's the basic setup. I'll have some images, hopefully in the show notes if I can dig up some. I don't have a simple setup out back right now, so I may have to borrow some images from somewhere else. Level 2. The level 2 is the intermediate setup, and this is one I spend a lot of time with. It's a bit more complex. In this scenario, you're using live vegetation. You might have live tree branches, live flowers, leaves, etc. You're not dealing with a dead stick or a dead branch or something like that. You're dealing with something that's living, and because of that, right off the bat, you got to figure out a way to keep the perch living, right? Because you can't have a dead flowers in a picture; it just looks bad. So what you do is you take a 20-ounce soft drink bottle, Coke bottle, whatever, fill it with water. Let's say you're using a branch off a tree. So I'm using a plum branch, and it's got it's all blossomed out. You just take that plum branch, you put it into the bottle with the water, and it's going to last for a few days. You can get a few days worth of shots out of that. So that's first and foremost. The bird feeder setup, it can be the same. You can use a simple setup for a bird feeder. That doesn't really change. You may have to actually clamp the bottle of water onto the branch with these clamps you can find in the hardware store that you use to hold wood together for drying purposes and so on. So it's a little more complex, a little more time sensitive. You can't just set this up in your backyard and hope that it stays alive for a month, Whereas a simple setup, you could leave it out there for the whole winter season if you wanted to. I want to talk a little bit here because you have other options for blinds. I want to talk a little bit about the pop-up blind. You can buy what's called a pop-up blind, and they're used for hunting mainly, but photographers also use them. And you can set this up in your backyard anywhere you want. It pops up. You can fold it back up when you're done. You can get one for between $75 and $100, and so it's relatively inexpensive. That's a great way to move the perch wherever you want. So you're not bound by the position of your house, for example. I mean, that's the struggle that I have with using my home for a blind, is that you're limited by a permanent blind. And so, eventually you're going to kind of outgrow the home blind a little bit because you're going to want to have different angles and different lighting conditions and so on. Although, honestly, I still use the home blind probably more than any other blind. Okay, so on to the advanced setup. The advanced setup is one that I'm currently working on and currently trying to replicate here in my studio. And this one gets more into the art of perch selection. I know it sounds kind of silly, but there is kind of an art to selecting a perch. It's a combination of everything in level 1 and 2, plus we're adding some additional features. So the bird feeder setup, first of all. Well, now you're advanced, you're trying to lure different species in and so on. You might use a platform feeder for this. You're trying to bring in various species like bluebirds. You're trying to lure more unusual birds like gnatcatchers or warblers or something like that. You're not dealing with your typical cardinals and blue jays and such that like bird seed. These other birds may like insects, for example. So you start changing your food source. That's one of the advanced setup options. Now your perch selection, this is where things get totally different. You might have that branch from the plum tree, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to shape that branch literally using a pair of scissors and cutting away places for the bird to actually rest. So it gets more advanced in that area. You might have to actually attach moss to the perch. So what do I mean by that? Well, you can actually go find moss in the woods. Let's say your perch is missing. This looks kind of funny because it's missing big chunks of moss along the side. You can actually physically put new moss on it and staple it with a stapler. I mean, this is the art side of it. It's however far you want to take this. You're kind of moving outside the realm of everyday wildlife photography. This is more, I'm trying to make a portrait of a bird. It's very much like you would go and have your portrait made at a studio. And so this is where the whole setup photography really comes into play, because in this case, you're really trying to shape the whole scenario. You're manipulating the whole scenario to get it exactly the way you want. You're going to bring other things into play, like water drips. For some reason, birds are extremely attracted to water, right? I mean, but not just water, the dripping of water. So they have what's called water drips. You're going to set up maybe a water fountain. Maybe you're going to set up more bird baths, whatever. You're trying to get different species to come in. So there's really advanced stuff here, and it can be very frustrating. And you just got to really slow down, look at the scene, draw it on a piece of paper if you have to, Photographers like Alan Murphy have just perfected this art, and it's not for the faint of heart. Let's put it that way. So, I mean, at this stage of the game, you would be a very advanced backyard setup photographer. But I want to put all this stuff in here because I don't know who's listening to this. Could be a beginner, could be somebody intermediate, trying to get into a more advanced scenario. I'll try to put various photographs into the show notes. Like I said, on the advanced side, I'm still learning myself, so that's a constant battle for me is trying to become more advanced, push myself to the next level. So I want to talk a little bit before we move on about lighting, because lighting is really the most important aspect in photography, and it's also the most important aspect in backyard bird setup photography. Watch the sun very carefully. The sun, as it rises in the east, you're going to have to watch the shadow on the subject. So what I'm saying is, different times of the year, the sun will be just about dead east. Other times it kind of shifts a little bit. You're going to see variations in how it comes up and how it sets, how it tracks across the sky. There's an app called Sunseeker that I recommend, which shows you exactly where it's going to rise, where it's going to set, and how it tracks across the sky. This is important because there's nothing worse, in my opinion, than a backlit songbird. Okay? Unless you're going for a silhouette, you've lost everything. Because when you backlight a bird, you've lost the sparkle in its eye. You've lost the light reflectivity or the iridescence of the feathers. That front lighting, or at least three-quarter lighting, is very important, because without it, it just looks flat and uninteresting. So let's say it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm shooting a bird in my backyard studio. I want to be facing west. So when I'm shooting, I want the bird in front of me. I want the sun rising up behind me, over my shoulder, and illuminating the bird. Don't put that in stone. There are times where you don't want completely flat lighting on a bird. I have seen good images that I've taken and other people have taken where they've used kind of a three-quarter or even almost side lighting, to where you really get to see the three-dimensional aspects of the bird. You get to see its shape better. It doesn't look as flat. So both are used. But again, honestly, 9 times out of 10, stay away from backlighting a bird. It just looks bad. I know there's people that like it. It's just my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of bird photographers. It just doesn't look right to me. It tends to look washed out because you're dealing with usually a large lens. You're getting a lot of lens flare possibilities in there. Like, again, if you're going for an artistic look and you have a specific scenario in mind, then by all means do it. But if you want to replicate some of the beautiful artwork that's out there now, then you'll need to use front lighting or three-quarter view lighting, side lighting, 45-degree angle, I guess is a better way to say it. Also, in advanced, along with the other advanced setup options, there is a way to completely illuminate your subjects and not use the sun. And I've used this with hummingbirds, for example. And what you're going to want to do, and this is really a subject for a completely different episode, but I'll give you a little bit of a summary of it. Essentially, you're going to use several flashes, at least 3 flashes. You're going to set up a natural background. You're going to have a flash at 45 degrees to the left. You're going to have a flash at 45 degrees to the right. And you're going to basically overpower the ambient light and shoot it just like you would a portrait in a studio. I mean, I don't want to, I guess in a way it's similar to like the traditional Olin Mills type of shot where you're just doing a portrait indoors. Essentially, that's what you're replicating with this really advanced flash setup. Do I recommend people do that to start out with? Absolutely not. You'll be very frustrated. But once you get kind of things down and you're moving into intermediate territory, yeah, start start playing around with it because you can do some really interesting things. Just realize that you're kind of stepping outside the boundaries of totally natural shots. And that's okay if that's what you're going for. There's times where it just makes sense, like with hummingbirds. You got to stop their wings. How do you do it? You overpower the ambient exposure with flashes, so you can, with short duration of flash, so you can freeze their wings. But anyway, that's totally a different episode, but I just wanted to put that in there because it is an important part of the setup photographer's toolkit. Basically, I'll try to put as much as I can in the show notes as far as examples of some of these types of shots. And like I said, I am not by any means an awesome setup photographer. I'm learning just like everybody else. If you want to check out an awesome setup photographer, go check out Alan Murphy. Awesome. I'll put his link in the show notes. I think he's probably the best setup photographer, backyard studio photographer out there. But I want to touch on just one more thing I kind of forgot to mention before, and that is perch selection. Perch selection is so critical, and it is also the most creative aspect of it. You can have all kind of different perches. You can use rocks. You can use old logs that have fallen on the floor of the forest. They've got moss on them, or just have a real weathered look, or a unique design in the wood. You can use what they call mounds, mounds, not to be confused with the nasty candy bar. And what that allows you to do is you can start doing ground shots. So let's say you've got a thrasher, for example. Now, thrashers typically do not perch to eat their food. They are on the ground and they literally thrash up the leaves and so forth and find insects. Well, a great way to photograph them is to pile up some dirt, lure them in with some kind of insects or maybe even suet or something like that. They'll feed on sometimes. You hide that behind the mound, and then in the mound you can put things like natural grasses that you've dug up, maybe even natural wildflowers and so on. So you can make a very interesting ground setup. And the cool thing about a ground setup is that you can really get down in your belly and get a very interesting out of focus background and foreground in your shot. And that's something that's hard to do with perches that are up off the ground, because generally you're going to have out of focus background, but you really don't have any foreground to speak of. So it's almost like you're shooting a mini landscape with a bird in it. It's a very interesting shot. Alan Murphy also does a lot of these. You can check that out on his website. But I mean, the great thing is this, the sky's the limit. This is one aspect of wildlife photography that you can really go nuts with. You don't have to go out in the freezing cold and sit for hours waiting for the shot. The other thing is about this is you'll never get these shots in the wild. I mean, when I say in the wild, I mean like out in the bush, because I don't want to say never, but you're going to get like one out of 1,000 images maybe that would look at this good in the wild. And so, like I said, I highly recommend it. It's great for people that don't have a lot of time on their hands. Great for family guys or women that just they can't be out of the house, away from their kids. They can't be. They work all the time and they have very limited time at home. Perfect for you. So, again, highly recommend it. Okay, welcome to the Know Your Subject segment of the podcast. In this segment, we're going to take one animal species. We're going to discuss how the animal behaves and how you can use this information to make you a better wildlife photographer. I truly believe, and I've said this before many times, that to be a better wildlife photographer, you need to know your subject, and you need to know what to expect from the subject you're photographing. The sound you just heard was that of the great egret. Cornell's Lab of Ornithology defines the great egret as a dazzling sight in many North American wetlands. Slightly smaller and more svelte than a great blue heron, they are still large birds with impressive wingspans. They hunt in classic heron fashion, standing immobile or wading through wetlands to capture fish with a deadly jab of their yellow bill. Here's some interesting facts about the great egret. Not all young that hatch survive the nestling period. Aggression among nestlings is common, and large chicks frequently kill their smaller siblings. This behavior, known as siblicide, is not uncommon among birds such as hawks, owls, and herons, and is often a result of poor breeding conditions in a given year. The oldest known egret was 22 years. He was banded in Ohio. The pristinely white great egret gets even more dressed up for the breeding season. A patch of skin on its face turns neon green, and long plumes grow from its back. These plumes were the bane of the egrets in the late 19th century, when such adornments were prized for ladies' hats. Thankfully, we are past that time period. So let's talk about how you photograph them, how do you photograph the great egret, and how you expose for their plumage. The great egret is a almost completely white bird, except for its eye, and the green patch he has on his face, and he has a yellow bill. Other than that, he's completely white. Oh, and his feet are a different color as well. It can be kind of an exposure nightmare dealing with that. And what I recommend that you do is first realize that you're probably shooting in the water, and so you've got probably a blue background, which can be quite dark. You've got a white bird in the foreground, obviously being very bright. I generally will spot meter the bird. A lot of photographers don't do this anymore. I think it's a great tool. I will spot meter the bird, and then I will adjust my exposure from there. Sometimes you need to open up a stop or two, because what happens is, it's kind of like photographing snow. What happens is, if you meter the snow will look dark in the image if you just go with what the meter tells you. So what I will do is I'll spot meter the bird, I'll open up a stop and shoot. If I get some good shots off that, fine. I might have to go 2 stops. The important thing here is that whatever you choose for an exposure, you have to get the plumage to show details. Their feathers have to have feather detail. It's so easy to blow out all that great detail in the feathers and really destroy the image. And that's what I see a lot. If you go online and you look at photographs taken of the great blue heron at Flickr or somewhere like that, you're going to see a lot of them with a lot of blown out highlights. And that's because they weren't paying attention to their metering, and they weren't paying attention to the exposure. This is one of my complaints that I have, is that people don't really understand exposure. And you really need to understand it from a classic perspective. When you don't understand exposure and you're letting the camera do everything for you, you are going to miss a lot of shots. Now, yeah, you can look at your histogram, you can look at your LCD, but if you're all the time looking at your LCD, you're going to miss a lot. You're going to miss behavior shots. You're going to miss that egret spearing that fish because you're busy messing around looking at your LCD instead of knowing what the exposure is going to be. Now, that said, I still make mistakes. I routinely will have problems with highlights because there's a lot of things that are different each time you go out. Things are different. The lighting's different. The sun is more intense. Maybe it's overcast. Overcast conditions, you don't worry so much about blowing the highlights because your meter's going to get it right. But when you've got that intense sunlight coming up from the east, hitting that bird full strength, man, you're going to have major reflection from that bird. So really need to think about it. Think about your exposure. The same holds true for any white bird. All of the egrets pretty much, except for the reddish egret. The snowy egret is another common wading bird we have here on the east coast of America. And same thing with them. You've got to watch that exposure. That's probably the most important thing. Other than that, what your end game is with a great egret is to get an interesting photograph, because the great egrets, they tend to stand still for a long period of time, because what they're doing is they're waiting for their prey to make a mistake and come through. They do have other things that they do, like moving their necks and trying to stir up prey in other ways, but generally they're going to stand there and move slowly through the water, and they're going to wait for the fish to make a mistake. That's what you're waiting for. What you'll see is all of a sudden you'll see him kind of stiffen up, and he'll get kind of closer. Sometimes they'll get closer to the water with their necks. That means they're getting ready to strike, and so you need to be ready at that point. As soon as you see any movement down, you just hold down that shutter button, because it's going to happen so fast, and you're going to get hopefully 8 frames in a second or something along those lines at least, and you're going to be able to get the fish. Now, with focus and so on, it's just a bit of luck, because sometimes even though you're focused right, he may move his head towards you more when he's striking, or back away from you more when he's striking. That's just something you got to deal with. You missed a shot. You either got it or you missed it with focus. You may have a great photograph of a speared fish, but it's out of focus. So many times, one of my pet peeves is, and I know it's probably silly, but you see all these shots, these great action shots of a great egret spearing a fish, but if you look closely, they're out of focus. They're not using high enough shutter speed, or they actually missed focus. And to me, that's a missed shot. I would not even post that photograph on Flickr. If I missed a shot, I missed a shot. Okay, and that's something that I think we all have to get used to as photographers. If we missed a shot, look, you missed a shot. Get over it. Move on. Start taking other photographs. You got to learn to be selective. You can't just say, "Wow, that's cool." Well, yeah, it's cool. He speared the fish. They do that all day long. But what's even cooler is you can get tack sharp. You can get the fish detailed in the fish. You can get the water droplets literally frozen in midair, where he's ripping the fish back out of the water. That kind of stuff is what you're looking for. A blurry, out of focus photograph, not good. So that's kind of my tips for photographing the great egret. And that really brings us to the end of this podcast episode. On the next episode, I'm actually going to do a full and intense review of the Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary lens, how it can be best used in the wildlife. I've been using this lens now for 6-7 months. I'll say right off, I'm impressed with it, but next week I'll give you the full rundown and see if it's something that might be something that you can use in your arsenal. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.